Again today, as we carry on reading Lamentations, it's a really bleak, devastating picture of what the prophet is seeing as he wanders around. And there's just a few things I draw from this. The first one is from verse 14. The visions of your prophets were false and worthless. They did not expose your sin to ward off your captivity. The prophecies they gave you were false and misleading. And elsewhere it says in the Bible that the wages of sin are death. And it makes that really, really clear. And that when we live in a way that is sinful, ultimately we die. Now, that doesn't mean in the same way, I think, that literally I do something wrong and then I'm killed by in a train crash or something like that. That's not what it means, but it does mean that ultimately that's where sin ends up. We end up in a place of death and a place of despair and a place of destruction. And this is where understanding the nature of God's commands to us is so important. His commands, we often think of them as rules, like, our parents give us rules to obey, and it's like, oh my word, this is so boring. Actually, the commands of God are there to bring us life. He directs us towards all that is good and towards all that is life. And it can sometimes feel like he's just having a go at us because we don't understand that, and we'd much rather do some other things than the things he seems to be telling us. But ultimately, the commands of God lead us to life. And to not obey them and to not submit to them and to not follow them leads us to a place of death. And it leads us to a place where our lives often, more often than not, are actually miserable, and something in us has died. So sin leads to death. That's the first thing. The second thing is, when you end up in that place, it still doesn't seem fair, and it still doesn't seem right, and it still doesn't become easy. And so when the guy's wandering around, even if he does acknowledge that Israel have done wrong, which he does at times, he still can't get his head around the scale of the suffering that he's witnessing in front of him. Mothers having to eat their children, lots of other stuff that he describes in the book there. And so he's still wrestling with it. And as I said yesterday, there's no simplistic answers that we can take to suffering from this book. It doesn't allow us to. It genuinely is a book of wrestling and questioning and asking. And yet in this small bit of Lamentations, there is a glimmer of hope, where it says in chapter 3, because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed. His compassions never fail. It goes on, great is your faithfulness. It's good to wait for the Lord. No one is cast off the Lord forever. Though he brings grief, he will show compassion. There's that clinging to the hope in the character of God. And the character of God is something that will never ever change. One of the words that people use to describe God is immutable, which just means he never changes. He's the unchanging one. So he's consistent. So while you and I have mood swings every day, and whether I'm nice to you depends on how I'm feeling in a particular moment, God is utterly, completely, and every day he's consistent. Every morning you wake up, his mercies are new. Every night when you go to sleep, his compassions never fail you. And the character of God is something that this guy clings to, even in the midst of all this evidence that seems to cry out otherwise.